here and connected on screen. Um, I, I decided to focus my presentation sharing some observations from the organization that I lead, an organization that is engaged in a multitude of different contexts, and most certainly in the situations that have arisen to the attention of the world most recently in the last couple of years, and that offer and where the interventions and the actions of the European Union offer some food for thought for the debate that we are having today. Those three countries are Afghanistan, Armenia, and of course, Ukraine. Three different scenarios, very different scenarios that also constitute three different situation or policy target for the European Union policy. For your information, the organization I lead, which is the International Center for Transitional Justice, is a strategic partner to the European Union in the implementation of their policy framework on support of transitional justice. And we are a member of a consortium that the European Union activates in areas of concern whenever the European Union delegations has queries or requires assistance in assessing or designing intervention in a particularly sensitive situation. The European Union Transitional Justice Policy is part of the European Union Action Plan on Human Rights and Democracy, which was the first cycle was 2015-2019 and was later extended. And basically has the scope of equipping the European Union as an organization to play a more active and consistent role in their engagement with partner countries and with international and regional organizations on transitional situations, let's say, on transitional justice. So let's start with Afghanistan. At some point during the negotiations for the withdrawal of the US military troops, we were asked to prepare, to work with the independent Afghanistan Human Rights Commission to prepare them to be part of the Doha talks. And we worked for several months with the Afghanistan Commission, Independent Commission of Human Rights, while efforts were made internally and externally to extend formally an invitation to the Commission to be an official part, to be officially part and have a seat in the negotiations. Negotiations that, as you will remember, included only the US government and the Taliban, where the Afghanistan government was invited at a much later stage. Unfortunately, while the president of the Afghanistan Independent Commission traveled to Doha a couple of times, she was not admitted in the big room. And then the events unraveled fairly quickly. They spun out of control and we arrived to the total regaining of control of almost part of the Afghanistan territory by the Taliban by the 15th of August. I just want to mention, to quote what Judy Dempsey, who is a senior researcher at the Carnegie Europe and the editor-in-chief of Strategy Europe, said on that day or shortly afterwards. The Taliban's rapid takeover of Afghanistan has made a mockery of the European Union security and defense policy. And she continued by saying that instead of combining forces, each European country implemented some emergency measures to extract their nationals, as well as those Afghani nationals that worked with their diplomatic representation to provide some humanitarian assistance, and very quickly wrapped up themselves into the discussion on whether and to which extent establish official contacts and relationship with the de facto government. So despite the years for calling for sharing resources, coordinating an action plan, Afghanistan clearly tested the Europe security policy, even at the civilian type of intervention, and considering the scale of urgency, demonstrated that we were not ready. I just want to mention a couple of things that I found pretty striking in the European Parliamentary Resolution of 16th of September 2021 on the situation of Afghanistan, which recognizes that the withdrawal of the US and international forces from Afghanistan is a manifestation, I'm quoting from the resolution, of a collective failure of Western foreign and security policy, and that will damage the credibility of the West, create a crisis of confidence, and require serious lessons to be drawn for the future, in particular when it comes to deciding on the nature and mandate of future military interventions. The resolution says two parts that I think are particularly relevant. The first, it urges the European Union to develop a response for a potential migration and refugee crisis. And I would like to remind the audience that Afghanistan was the producer of the largest amount of refugee in the world. And it urges the Union to provide additional support to Afghanistan neighboring countries who are hosting the refugees, and most urgently conclude and implement its new pact on asylum and migration, so to be able to face the migration flows in a more effective and human manner. And it concludes that paragraph saying the European Union shoulders its moral responsibility in reception and integration. The second element is a wake-up call, as the resolution says, for the European Union for necessary reforms. The crisis proves the need to reinforce its capacity to autonomously strengthen the defense cooperation and building a genuine European defense union. So the Afghanistan crisis seemed to have created a broad agreement within the European Union itself that Afghanistan needed to be dealt differently and more autonomously. And that in order to equip it, in order to do so, there was a need to equip the organization with policies and strategies and standard operating procedure on crisis prevention, stabilization, peace building, and not only to pursue whatever peace or stabilization could be possible in Afghanistan from now on, but in areas that are much closer to the European heart, like Middle East, the Sahel, and certainly already at that time, a big concern about the relationship with Russia. So what we witnessed was that without the US support, European partners were unable to handle any logistic operations in Afghanistan. In the weeks that followed the Taliban regime regaining control, we worked 24/7 to extract as many partners, activists, witnesses, victims of atrocity that had shared their testimony to enrich the documentation of the Afghanistan Human Rights Commission. And the only reliable partner at the end of the day was the US State Department. The other big thing that the other big wound that I carry in relation to Afghanistan is that even during the turmoil, when it was clear that the Afghanistan Authority would have lost very quickly control over institutions and all the structure, the issue was to export, preserve, and maintain the chain of custody of very sensitive documents in the Office of the Prosecution, as well as in the Afghanistan Human Rights Commission. And Afghanistan authorities and ourselves, together with other INGOs, we pleaded multiple European countries that had supported actively, financially, and with other resources, the development of human rights policy, reforms of the Afghanistan institution, and so on, to take over the the custody of these documents, and we failed miserably. So there is a wealth of information, of extremely sensitive information with name, surnames, and other circumstances that are out there, hidden somehow, but extremely vulnerable. We continue to work with the support of the European partners to help the Afghanistan civil society and authorities that are now in exile, including the recreation of the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission. In most recent weeks, a very critical partner has become the United Nations Special Advisor for the prevention of genocide. This is what we are talking about right now. Yes, genocide following the systematic persecution of all minorities in Afghanistan, particularly the Azari community. So this is already a quite grim situation. But let's come to another conflict that maybe has not been so well portrayed, or that in relation to which maybe in the West that we have not heard so much, which is the conflict in Armenia. As you probably know, the conflict in Armenia relates to the Nagorno-Karabakh region, which after the fall of the former Soviet Union declared to want to pursue autonomy. That triggered an internal conflict that then amounted to a full scale war between 92 and 94. And since 94, that has continued to be a so-called dormant conflict until 2020, when, for some surprisingly, the conflict reactivated. There are many reasons why I was not surprised by the reactivation of the conflict, particularly based on the process of democratization and reforms that Armenia had embarked in since the 2018 Velvet Revolution, which was somehow observed by the powerful neighbor without much interference until the conflict re-exploded. And therefore, Armenia found itself dependent on Russia intervention and protection. During the dormant years of the conflict, the big hub for the negotiations of a possible peace agreement and political settlement was the OSCE Minsk group, which didn't really produce much until 2000. And the European Union was certainly involved indirectly, because one of the chair of the OSCE was a European partner. But with the reactivation of the war, basically the big inconsistency or limitation of the EU policy in that region, the South Caucasus region, became more apparent. A goal to follow consistently the European policy on promotion of democratization in the long term, based on the same values that guided the European Union member states integration, exported and applied to different regions with different historical and political societal tensions, while never engaging in what we call in transitional justice, the root causes of the conflict, which were based in that sub-region, the Nagorno-Karabakh region. So no intervention of peace building, no funding of conflict resolution initiatives, very little connection between the standard judicial institutional reforms promoted and funded by the EU, particularly in Armenia, with these latent, dormant conflict that still cause much of the problems in the Armenian institution framework. The power of the military, the impunity of corruption and other endemic form of co-opting the states that prevented really the success of these reforms. Now, the apparent reluctance to relate to the conflict as, on one hand, limited the long-term policies of the EU in the two countries, but certainly had direct implications when the conflict restarted. Now, on the good side, the OEC Minsk group remains the only viable, the only negotiating table. And the EU has taken a much stronger, prominent role in that negotiation politically, particularly after the ceasefire of November and then the so-called peace agreement of January 2021. But there have been a number of things that, in my view, are to be credited to the European Union, or at least to the chairman of the co-chairman of the Minsk group, to which, by the way, another parallel track was associated, which is the quadrilateral meeting between President Aliyev, Prime Minister Pashinyan, the President of the European Council, and the member of OEC, that brought some concrete results. The return of of the prisoners of war, the mutual recognition by Azerbaijan and Armenia of their territorial integrity, even the preparation of a very interesting interstate agreement where the protection of the Armenian national residing in Nagorno-Karabakh is included. So all positive things. On the other hand, the president of the European Commission in her visit in July to Azerbaijan to secure another provision of gas, declared that Azerbaijan is a very trustworthy partner, and that has caused obviously some concern on the Armenian side. The fact remains that until now, Brussels and Moscow remain the two only reliable point of contact of political and international negotiations in relation to the conflict. It requires, however, a broader attention and a broader support by the international community at large, because it's a conflict that doesn't seem, particularly in the current state of affairs, very understood or very prominent in our collective thinking of international policy. And therefore, there is a risk that actually it remains a very volatile region, a country that in any event has no, particularly Armenia, has no chance but to remain associated to its powerful protector. And by the way, all the efforts that were made until now to bring the situation of Nagorno-Karabakh to the attention of the United Nations Security Council were obviously shut down by Russia and France, which is the other co-chair of the Minsk group. And now we come to the atrocious conflict of Ukraine. But before that, I apologize. I forgot to say, just to frame it really in the European policy. It is quite interesting to note that in the 2021 annual human rights report of the European Union, Human Rights and Democracy report, the Armenian-Azerbaijan conflict and human rights issues related to the conflict are not included. While, of course, the occupation of Crimea was already very clearly, very prominently included. For the case of Armenia, the only relevance to the conflict in the European Union enlargement policy in promoting security sector governance and reform, alongside with good governance enhancement, fostering the process of constitutional reform and anti-discrimination law, gender-based violence, freedom of association. All very important things, not a single connection to the atrocities that are being committed and are being suffered in part of the Armenian territory or the Azerbaijan territory. In the case of Azerbaijan, the only reference is, and I quote, in that report, the annual report on human rights and democracy, the European Union delegation and several EU member states embassies visited the returned territories, returned to Azerbaijan, and were acquainted with the reconstruction measures taken in the best interest of both communities. And now we come to Ukraine. Another disclaimer. I am half Ukrainian. So I always say it for the sake of intellectual honesty, because I certainly carry some of the bias in my analysis. Let's start by saying that Ukraine was largely invisible to the European Union in the first decade after its independence. The relationship were based on a vague EU-Ukraine partnership and cooperation agreement dated 94. It was the same, pretty much the same model that was offered to all countries of the former Soviet Union, and none of the 15 at that time European Union members saw Ukraine as a priority. It was too far, too little understood, and certainly in the legitimate circle of influence of Russia. So when Ukraine started appearing in the European Union radar, probably in 2004, right, when there was the first, I mean, the bigger enlargement, and same time with the Orange Revolution, that in Ukraine brought a very strong tendency towards pro-Western and values, and at the same time, the first democratic-leaning government was elected in Ukraine. At that point, the European Union was forced to think about a special policy for Ukraine, and similarly to Poland, which actually joined in 2004, the European agenda included a large program of reforms to help Ukraine become a well-governed, democratic country, policy that was inserted in the European neighboring policy and in the Eastern Partnership Initiative. Now, clearly, there was a role for Ukraine to play in ensuring that the entire Eastern region progressed according to European democratic values, right? And the reaction within, vis-a-vis these purpose or this ambition, the European member states formed pretty much two groups. The one that we call the idealistic activists, and are mainly the Central European countries that had joined the European Union, which certainly saw Ukraine as the next step. Right? And so the many reasons why, in their view, Ukraine could have an important role, considered the cultural links, the huge potential of its market, and so on. The other group we call the pragmatic conservatives, that simply thought that Kiev was legitimately a Moscow affair, and they were only interested in Ukraine as a very profitable large market. I don't bore you with the data, but Ukraine at that time offered a market of over 45 million people. 70% of its arable land is extremely fertile, as we know. More importantly, was the second largest border with the European Union of 8,300 kilometers. Since then, the electricity system of Ukraine has been partly, if not largely, integrated in the European network of transmission system operators for electricity. And Europe became more and more dependent on energy sources that transit through Ukraine. So from a foreign or external policy relations points of view, the 2000, let's say in the 2000s, Ukrainian-Russian cooperative agreement was considered an important contribution also to the control of other critical situations, which were mainly Transnistria and Moldova. So the political significance of Ukraine starts emerging, both because of the internal evolution, political evolution, as well as the external new design of the European Union borders. We come fast forward to the annexation of Crimea and the occupation of Donbass. The annexation of Crimea was first addressed by the European Union in the extraordinary meeting of the heads of state on March 6, 2014. In that joint statement, the European leaders condemned Russia, of course, unprovoked violation of Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity, and called on Russia to immediately withdraw its armed forces and allow immediate access to international monitors. They obviously condemned the decision to hold a referendum in Crimea. And although recognizing Russia's responsibility of the unrest in Crimea, they called, reasonably so, for negotiations between Ukraine and Russia and for a peaceful resolution of the crisis. At that time, no restrictive measures were announced, what we call the alternative sanctions, or alternative remedies of accountability. No sanction, no other restrictive measure. The only response was a suspension of bilateral talks on visa matters. The European Union later introduced some restriction on economic relations with Crimea, and only announced personal sanctions, bans, and asset freezes on Russia and Crimean officials. But this regime was never reviewed. And even after the Russian officials have publicly declared the Crimea as annexed after the military operation. We know that then the occupation expanded to the Donbass. We know that in any event, very little was done by the West to really engage in a conflict resolution and a peace building project in that area. And we come tragically to the 24th of February of this year. What is the reaction of the European Union to the invasion of Ukraine? There are four major lines of intervention. The first is the individual and economic sanctions, which include financial system restrictions, as we know, that span from the assets freeze, and then progressively, with some difficulty, come to the SWIFT ban, prohibition of transaction with Russian and Belarus banks, ban on crypto wallets of Russian citizens, and so on. The restriction on movements of goods, services, and people. The sanction on energy resources, to which we all are a victim, and we will be even more in the winter, and the sanction on armory, which include all ban on arms of any kind, and the ban on export from Russia of steel products. The second block is obviously the assistance to the Ukrainian military, and there the implications were quite striking, from a complete change of policy from member states that had traditionally a very different take and policy vis-a-vis military armament and military interventions, like Germany. And the numbers are also staggering in terms of quantity. I mean, 2.6 billion given to the Ukrainian armed forces, the creation of a military assistance mission in support of Ukraine, the allocation of budgetary and extra budgetary funds to help the intervention in Ukraine and the resistance of Ukraine. But luckily, there is also the block of assistance of what we call the solidarity lanes with Ukraine. And there, 348 million were given to humanitarian assistance to Ukraine and Moldova. In addition to additional material assistance to Ukraine and neighboring countries through the European Union Civil Protection Mechanism, 20 billion given to member states hosting Ukrainian refugees, up to 9 million of macro financial assistance to foster stability, which I'm to this day unclear what they translated into, but they are there. And very critical, the reception of a large flux of refugees under temporary mechanisms that were agreed by European member states with unprecedented speed. And that is the creation of what we call in the United Nations the first double standard. Establishment also of the European Union Solidarity Fund for Ukraine, which the title of it for a practitioner of transitional law is very promising. But then if you look into it, it includes support in the investigation and prosecution of war crimes. The member states, by the way, together with other partners, have referred the situation of Ukraine to the International Criminal Court, in addition to the case that the prosecutor of the ICC had already opened on its own initiative. And it also includes this Solidarity Fund, the European Union Advisory Mission for Civilian Security Sector Reform in Ukraine, that allow, it's a new set of rules that allow the mission, the European mission, to provide strategic advice and training to the Ukrainian authorities to facilitate the investigation and prosecution of any international crimes. So the expectation that Ukraine, a country at war, will be able to provide fair trial to individuals that have allegedly committed war crimes and other international crimes in its territory. And third, but not least, the creation by Eurojust of a joint investigation team into alleged core international crimes committed in Ukraine. All of these is additional to the efforts of the Ukrainian national authorities to prosecute those crimes that, as of the 27th of September of this year, amounted to 37,000 criminal cases open, which is a number that no democratic country with the strongest judicial institution can manage. These different mechanisms, joint investigation team, the Ukrainian prosecution authority, the International Criminal Court, they don't speak to each other. And that I can testify. That it's not even a matter of coordination of effort. It's not even a matter of strategic or prosecutorial strategy, which is the ABC in transitional context. You select a number of cases to prove a theory of crime which is emblematic of the conflict you are trying to address. There is nothing of this sort. It's opening cases after case, documenting the most atrocious violation of human rights. And some of you may have read the report of the United Nations Commission of Inquiry that was released last week at the General Assembly, which brought us back to a level of atrocities that rarely in my life I've seen. So, over-focus on criminal prosecution. And then we come to the last big element of in the response of the European Union to the Ukrainian crisis, which is the so-called reconstruction of a democratic Ukraine, which is the one I honestly care the most, because being my country, I really would like to have it to have a future, a democratic, pluralistic, inclusive, and accountable institution future. Now, this plan is very much modeled on a more modern, if you wish, Marshall Plan. misses for the time being the all what we have learned in 20 years of application of this discipline, which is you need to contend with a society that is highly traumatized. You need to modulate and design responses for the victims of atrocities that have a different background, different needs and expectations, because those will be your citizens that you expect to behave and adhere to democratic values. And you need to come up with emergency, urgent reparation that would enable the victims to play a role and to become not a weight for the future society of Ukraine that will be already devastated from an infrastructural point of view. Ukraine also presents some very peculiar elements from a international and transitional justice point of view. The refugees, the gender element of the refugee population, women predominantly who left, leaving behind even young Ukrainians that stayed because they knew they would be called at some point to join the resistance, and that have in the meantime, because of the peculiarities of their society, generally middle or highly educated, integrated in the host countries. This has implication for the future of a society that emerged from a conflict, for example. It has, there is very little focus on, if we are not able, because we will not be able to prosecute Russia, the Kremlin, and probably not even the highest echelon of the military of the Russian army. So what do we do with those cases? What makes a bigger contribution to the reconstruction of Ukraine and Ukrainian society? Which cases do we prosecute? What is the most felt crime or pattern of crimes that were perpetrated, and why it is significant for the future of Ukraine? To conclude, the war in Ukraine has changed not only my life, but I think the life of many. We have seen a return to a paradigm that internationally we thought was overcome years ago, the dilemma justice versus peace. So we are now in two blocks, those that peace at all costs, regardless of the concession that Ukraine must make in order to reach peace with Russia, regardless of what could be a future from an international stabilization point of view if Ukraine concedes something, and the block of justice needs to be pursued, but justice according to Western values, internationally driven, with false expectations of prosecuting everything at all levels. Second, the over-focus, as I said, on criminal prosecution, forgetting that actually peace in situation of post-conflict is not based on the results of criminal prosecution, as important as a signal these criminal prosecutions can be, but it is based on victims being repaired, potential threat to democracy, and the resurgence of autocratic forces be contained democratically in an open political dialogue. With institutions that will be very fragile, if existing at all, after the war. And so I would say there are some opportunities here, not only for the European Union, which in my view is directly confronted and threatened by what is happening, but for the world at large. The first is the hope that this conflict, in whatever manner it will eventually end, will create the energy to really revamp international law and the respect for international obligations. The second is the hope that multilateralism will regain some force. And in multilateralism, of course, I count on the European Union that has shown, like in the previous conflict I mentioned, a level of unity that was certainly an element to counter the Russian aggression. And third, it will test, however, in the long term, in the future of Ukraine and the eastern part of Europe, what we collectively are able to pursue those goals that were certain and values that were certainly paramount to integrate Europe, but they not be possible or politically adequate in those regions.